Hello and welcome to this week's Preps Preview alongside Justin Conn. I'm Aren Dow. The first 2 weeks, I think we had quite a few surprises, but this past week it seemed like, a lot of the teams that were maybe expected to win did win. But definitely a couple close games. I know you were at one at Sullivan, and they hosted Tuscola, ended up getting a big win there.
Yeah, we lucked out. This week was not nearly as earth-shattering, but the games that you and I went to were kind of the ones that were the landmark games. Tuscola traveled to Sullivan. I think most people thought that was, the CIC is Tuscola's conference to lose, and they were the favorites. And Sullivan really hadn't beaten a team like Tuscola in a long, long time. And right away in that game, really it felt like Tuscola was going to roll. And Nick Bates is definitely as good as advertised. I think having seen him last year, not to this year, I definitely saw his continued growth as a player. And man, there's just not much this guy can't do. But just as that game wore on, it just seemed like Sullivan, was able to wear Tuscola down, and especially on the line. And I think with Bates, early on they didn't have answers for him at certain things, and even into the second half, he was able to kind of keep Tuscola moving. But Tuscola didn't run the ball well, other than Bates, and then at some point Sullivan kind of started getting pressure on him, which that was really where the game started changing when they had a couple of big sacks of Bates, and then their running game, which didn't do anything in the first half, really started going. So it was just kind of that classic, finding something that worked with the read option, and then really just having the kind of line that was able to wear Tuscola down in this game. And I think that this just isn't something you've seen from Sullivan in the past, and the excitement there at the field, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, Nick Bates had that 66-yard run to open the game up. Nice to see Sullivan able to, overcome that and, not get too down after a huge touchdown run from Nick Bates, and still able to, stay with it and get that comeback win.
Right. And even on the sideline, I heard some guys going, okay, let's go out and do it to them. And they didn't do it right away, but eventually it was sort of like that, where in the second half, it was Nick Frericks on that read option, which, and I hope to get a chance to write about this a little bit this week, where, you have an old school coach in Gerald Temples that's, been willing to adapt. They're in the shotgun almost every play, and they really found that, and it worked so well in the second half. Frericks did not throw the ball real well in this game. I thought they had some chances, and I thought this was something maybe Tuscola needed to be worried about going forward. Just was how many open receivers there were, but he wasn't able to hit those guys. But then in the second half, he just ran. He was carrying guys at times. Frericks was, and really impressive. And I think going forward, Sullivan's a team that's, I don't know that they're equipped to blow. And I know their first two teams, they blew some teams out, but they're not a team that's going to blow teams out, but they're going to be a tough team to beat. No question about that going forward in the conference.
I went out to Mount Zion, and they lost a heartbreaking, 1-point loss to Mascoutah, where they were ahead, the whole game until the last 5 minutes, where Mascoutah had a late touchdown run with about 2 minutes left, and they kicked an extra point that put them up by 1. And I feel like in that first half, it felt like Mount Zion, they had an 8-point lead, and they had a couple turnovers, and you kind of felt like, okay, they had a couple turnovers, they'll correct that. And that second half, they did the same thing. They had a couple more turnovers, and really at some inopportune times. The offense was moving well. They were getting yards, and they had, the turnovers just happened to be right in the red zone. And so I wouldn't, I don't think my opinion of Mount Zion changed a whole lot from this game, but they do need to correct those turnovers. That's definitely a problem, and there were a couple of botched snaps. Peyton Grindstaff, it was definitely a colder September than usually is, and I talked to Mike Popovich. He said, that hasn't been the case the first 2 weeks, so it's kind of an anomaly here in the third week where they had that. But they have Brandon Price, who can hit that sideline route. They just kind of Grindstaff has the arm to put it up there for him, and Price is a big kid. He has the size that he can put his body into the receiver and create some space. You have Mason Bruce, who can also have that, and they had a lot of bubble screens to Bruce, Austin Thacker, and Max Gensler. And Max Gensler almost. I felt like he had a catch, and I thought it was a touchdown for a second, and then they said no, he dropped it at the last second, and so there are a lot of close calls for Mount Zion. I think that the defense, even though they had some problems running the ball, is massively improved from last year. And the running backs that Mascuda had, they had the guy that's going to run you over, the guy that's going to run around you, and someone in between. So they had 3 fresh options at running back, and they just weren't able to, they hit the right moments in that second half to get the stops they needed. But out of these first 3 weeks, I think if you look at the body work that Mount Zion's put together so far, I still think it's impressive. Going in 2-1 into conference play. And now they play Mattoon, and they get another home game against Mattoon. And they will be without Austin Thacker, who was tossed at the very end of the game against Mascoda. So they will be without him, which I think does hurt a little bit because Mount Zion runs so many four wide sets where they have a lot of different options on the field. And I'm not really sure who the next guy is that they would promote. But they still, they brought Tyler Hayes. They passed him out of the backfield a little bit in that Mascoda game, and I think you might see that a little bit more, especially if Mattoon brings pressure like Mascoda did last week. But I think Mattoon does. I mean, they're built more like Mount Zion, where you have a quarterback's probably going to throw a little bit more rather than a running game like Mascoda had. But I think it's an important win for Mount Zion to get this week against Mattoon. Kind of looking at the rest of their schedule, see from more of that last week, it's going to be a tough game, and Taylorville I think it's going to be a pretty tough game. So I think this is going to be a good game, an important game for them to win this week.
You mentioned that game, and it's kind of funny that after last week where there was maybe a little more predictable results, this is the week that things start really getting interesting. I think there was a game in every conference this week, a big game. And, of course, we had the start of conference play in the Okaw Valley, in the Apollo, and also the Little Okaw Valley. So, yeah, I mean, this is kind of a week where really things get going in the football season.
And there's a good matchup, really, in every single conference to start this off.
You mentioned the Apollo matchup that was big. Of course, in the Central Illinois Conference, there's a couple of big ones. I think the biggest one is Shelbyville at Tuscola. Shelbyville's had 3 games where they've blown out their opponents. Not necessarily, they haven't really been tested yet, though.
Right.
Tuscola's coming off that loss where they're not going to want to lose a couple in a row here and fall 0-2 in the CIC. So I really feel like that's an interesting matchup. And with Tuscola, we talked about Bates a little bit. I do think that one thing they really need to do, and something they can do going forward to improve, is kind of trying to fit the game plan to his strengths a little bit better. Because he throws the ball very well. And I think that was something that they didn't necessarily take advantage of as much as they would like to against Sullivan. They had some good passing plays, but they also had some balls that went through receivers' hands and things like that. That if they can, it did seem like plays where they could just kind of roll a guy into the flat and he's great on the run. I mean, he really does a good job on that. I think you'll see him going forward doing a lot more rollout type stuff, and I think it's going to be an interesting game, but at this point, Shelbyville's averaging more than 50 points a game, and I'm not sure, that anybody's going to slow them down.
Yeah, they haven't been tested so far, and this may be the first game where they are. And they have so many different options that they can kind of spread around a little bit, but Tice Robinson has gotten the majority of carries so far, and Lucas Duckett at quarterback has been very efficient. And, I think part of that is, some of the teams that they've played, he's, been able to pick and choose, but still, he's played very well. I think he's completed more than 70% of his passes. And they can afford to do that when they have such a good running game. That if they see something they like, that he can pass, and he can pass it well to a lot of different options.
And it's funny because that's another coach in Mark Ramsey that's really adapted his style. Who would have thought that Ramsey was going to coach a team that threw as much as Shelbyville is now? But he's done a good job with that. When you have a quarterback that can do that, why not use him? The other big game that we'll touch on real quick is Warrensburg-Sullivan. Talked about Sullivan a little bit. Obviously, Warrensburg has had a couple of games here in a row where the offense has really clicked, and Austin Tucker's ran for as many touchdowns as most guys run in their career in 2 weeks here now. So, I think it's 12 touchdowns in 2 weeks, which is just, and they weren't all rushing, but he scored 12 in 2 weeks, which is just mind-boggling. And you got to start thinking, well, it was against, Meridian and South Fork, but Warrensburg hasn't beaten teams like that in a long time, so now all of a sudden they've kind of thrown themselves in the mix in the conference.
And I think it's the way that they've beaten those teams, where it's been a blowout for both of those. So yeah, I think Warrensburg's making their play. I mean, we talked about this a little bit last week, where they're definitely a fringe playoff team. And after these last couple of weeks, I mean, I feel pretty comfortable in saying that 5 wins is definitely realistic for them. Looking at the CS8, this is the big matchup. I think MacArthur versus SHG, and this is going to be by far the hardest test MacArthur will face probably all year. I mean, unless they make it to a state title game, I think this will probably be the toughest matchup they play all year. SHG is just, I've said this before, they're just a different kind of animal. I mean, they have so many different options. Gabe Green at quarterback. That offense scored 42 points against Jacksonville in the first quarter last week. They have 3 running backs that are all good. They have 2 linemen one is committed D1 already, one's another one that's getting looks. It's just a different type of team in SHG. And, if MacArthur can stay with them, I think even for a half, that's a success. I mean, this is a team that's favored to win the state championship in 6A. And, I mean, if you're hanging with that kind of team, I think that says a lot about you. This is going to be a tough game for MacArthur. But, if they can get a couple things that they can just look and say, hey, we were able to do it against SHG, I think that's enough of a positive for them.
And I know that's not what MacArthur wants to hear. Their confidence is riding really high right now after the first 3 games. They feel like they're, world beaters. But I think you're right. I think that if they hang with SHG, if they score some touchdowns against the starters, things like that, kind of all of a sudden you got to. I think that's probably as big as any of the wins so far if they can do that. So I think we all recognize that SHG is just a different animal at this point. Switching over to the Little Illini. You have this is the big one. It's been the big one the last couple of years. KZ Westfield at Robinson. Robinson's not really done much against KZ. They lost to him 34-0 last year, but so far this year it's kind of hard to compare. They've both beaten up on Flora, but I know Robinson kind of wanted to take that next step this year, and beating KZ would be part of taking that next step.
Yeah, I thought Casey's been dominant these first 3 weeks. And I thought maybe Isaac Elkins might throw a little bit more than Stepina, but really even in that close game against Newton, he still only threw 12 times. I mean, this is still a run first team. I mean, this is still a Casey team that I think that they will run the ball, and they have a couple different guys that can do that. And so yeah, I think maybe they'll throw a little bit more if Robinson makes it a close game, but I still think this is definitely a run first team in Casey.
And we know Robinson is going to run the ball a lot with Jason Richard and Joe Smith. So it should be a pretty fast game, I would think.
I would think so.
In the LOVC, and this is the conference that the Northwest Division is the one we've been talking about all year, saying I don't know really what's going on with this conference, and now the games start. And I do think, though, that Arcola, and that was a team that we were kind of like, I don't know, going into the year. They had the 3 wins last year. Yeah, they had everybody back, and there were some really good players. But even those 3 wins last year were, against teams you were like, well, I don't, those don't impress you, And so far, they've been the most impressive team in that conference. So, and of course, they play Argenta, but really, I don't think the bigger game is Sangamon Valley at Arthur Levington, just because. Really, that's going to, whoever wins that game not only has a chance to still win the conference, but you're on a lot better footing as far as playoffs go. I think there's going to be, I really do feel like this is going to kind of be a who knows what happens a week-to-week thing in this conference. So you got to get all the wins you can now, and 5 wins is going to be tough to get.
Yeah, I mean, both already have 2, and, Tyler Schuring, he definitely a dual threat, but I think he's, he had that, I think, game 2 weeks ago where he had like 250 yards passing. But, the last couple of weeks, I mean, he's been rushing up and down the field. I think he got 19 carries for 346 yards in these last 2 games. I mean, that's outrageous. So Sangamon Valley will definitely need to, have that line, and definitely the linebackers, be on the lookout for Schuring at all times. I mean, he is. And we said this all year. I mean, right now, I think he still is the favorite out of the LOVC. It's kind of like that offensive player of the year. And, Sangamon Valley, a tough game against a really tough opponent in Moments last week. But I think if they beat Arthur, I think they kind of positioned themselves right up there with Arcola, right? At kind of the top of the conference right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think that I don't think Schuring's going to be able to run on Sangamon Valley like that. I think if Arthur's going to win this game, they're going to have to throw the ball. And because I really like Sangamon Valley's run defense so far this year. And then, we also get going in the Okaw Valley this week, and it's a really interesting matchup with Unity at Monticello. Obviously, Unity is number 2 in 3A right now, and looks like they're back from what was for them maybe a little bit of a down year last year. And Monticello that was a really bad time for a loss last week. And we don't know a ton about Clifton Central and don't really know exactly what to take from that loss. But what we do know is they have Unity, St. Joseph Ogden, Moreau, Forsyth. This is the 3 weeks of their games right now. They could realistically be 2-4 after that stretch, and then all of a sudden you're fighting for your life, to make the playoffs. And I really still like the Sages team. I liked what I saw against Macomb, and I think that they, are definitely a playoff caliber team. But at this point, it's where do you find wins in this schedule? Or especially over the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, a tough opponent, Unity, who maybe hasn't had the toughest schedule so far in this first 3 weeks. I think almost everybody from that Okaw coming into conference play. They're coming against maybe their toughest opponents that they will face all season. So Unity probably will. Like Monticello, probably have their toughest opponent this week. Yeah, Brandon Wildman's been good all year, and maybe his worst game, but it's still. He passed. He was 17 for 35. If that's your worst game, he's still playing really well. He still passed for 200 some odd yards. So I think even though a down game, I still think Monticello's floor is very high. I'm in agreement with you. I still like the Sages team. And it was a close loss. It wasn't a blowout loss to Clifton Central.
Right.
Only a touchdown. So yeah, I still like this Monticello team. But you're right. Getting a win, before you jump into this stretch, and probably St. Joe, I would say the toughest team of those three. Getting a win here will be big.
No question.
Coming into the stretch.
And Unity did have that week 1 win against St. Teresa where they really blew out St. Teresa, and we're really not quite sure what to make of that game.
Right.
And so is Unity that much better than St. Teresa? Or are they that? Because if they are, they're really, really good. And I guess we'll find out after this game. I think we're going to find out a lot this week in all the games. Of course, we'll be on Twitter. Pick'em's going to be brutal this week. I still haven't made up much ground yet. So
also, congrats to Andy Curley. You won last week. Saragordo coach.
That's pretty cool. I'm not feeling real good about this week. I'm not going to do any bragging. So just check us out on HR Preps, and we'll see you out at the games.